Tuesday, April 10, 1945. Near Hagen, Ruhr Valley, Germany. 17-year-old Volkssturmmann Klaus Steiner held a tin cup of hot coffee in trembling hands and stared at the dark liquid as if it might dissolve his understanding of the world. The aroma alone contradicted everything. Rich, deep, real. Not the bitter acorn brew his mother had boiled from tree bark. Not the roasted grain that passed for Ersatzkaffee in the Hitler Youth barracks. This was genuine coffee, and an American sergeant had simply handed it to him through the wire without a word. Steam rose from the cup, warming Klaus's dirt-streaked face. Around him, 300 captured German soldiers sat in the mud of a hastily erected prisoner compound, all clutching identical cups, all wearing the same expression of disbelief. Some wept, others laughed inappropriately. Klaus's hands shook so violently the coffee sloshed against the rim. "They're fattening us for slaughter," muttered Horst Becker, a 53-year-old postal worker from Dortmund who crouched beside Klaus. "It's how they killed the Jews. Food first, then the gas." Klaus wanted to believe that. It would make sense. It would align with everything Hauptsturmführer Weber had told them during training. But the coffee was real. The warmth spreading through his empty stomach was undeniable. And the American soldiers beyond the wire weren't acting like the savage monsters from the newsreels. They were laughing, smoking cigarettes, throwing a ball back and forth with casual indifference to the huddle of defeated enemies watching them. Klaus Steiner had been a soldier for exactly 43 days. Before that, he'd been a student at the Realschule in Wuppertal, studying mathematics and dreaming of becoming an engineer. That dream had ended on February 25th, when the remaining boys in his class received their call-up papers. His father's factory had been bombed into rubble the previous September. His older brother Matthias had been killed at Kursk in 1943. His mother survived on turnip soup and memories. The Volkssturm training had lasted 1 week. They'd practiced marching. They'd been issued armbands and told to find their own weapons. Klaus had received a Czech rifle manufactured in 1918, 20 rounds of ammunition, and a speech about defending the fatherland to the last breath. The speech had been longer than the rifle instruction. What Klaus remembered most clearly from training was the propaganda film they'd watched in a converted brewery. American soldiers, the narrator had explained, were criminals released from prison to fight. They were mongrels, racial degenerates, Jews and Negroes led by capitalist warmongers. The footage showed destroyed German cities and claimed the Americans ate from golden plates while German children starved. The Americans tortured prisoners. The Americans showed no mercy. The Americans were coming to exterminate the German people. Klaus had believed every word. Why wouldn't he? The Hitler Youth leaders had said the same. The radio broadcasts repeated it. The posters plastered across Wuppertal's ruins showed caricatured American soldiers with fangs and claws. His teacher, Herr Schäfer, who'd lost both sons in Russia, had stood before the class and sworn that death was preferable to American capture. The numbers should have told a different story, but Klaus had never seen them assembled in one place. Germany's war production in 1944, 19,000 aircraft. America's production in the same year, 96,000. Germany's tank production, 9,000. America's, 17,000. Germany issued its frontline soldiers 1 pound of meat per week when available. American soldiers received 2 pounds of fresh meat daily, plus vegetables, bread, canned fruit, and dessert. Germany had been eating its seed corn for 2 years, burning furniture for warmth, and drinking coffee made from acorns. Klaus's entire city had been on starvation rations since 1943. The real coffee in his hands represented more value than his family's monthly food allocation. But he hadn't known that American soldiers received real coffee every morning. He hadn't known the United States produced more food than it could consume. He hadn't known anything except what Goebbels had told him to know. The capture had happened so fast, Klaus barely remembered the sequence. His Volkssturm company, 214 boys and old men with a handful of rifles and 4 Panzerfausts between them, had been ordered to hold a crossroads near Hagen. They'd dug foxholes in the April rain. They'd waited. Then, American tanks had appeared from 3 directions simultaneously, supported by infantry in fresh uniforms carrying automatic weapons that fired faster than anything Klaus had ever seen. The Volkssturm commander, a 60-year-old grocer named Zimmermann who'd fought in the First World War, had taken one look at the approaching armor and raised a white flag made from a bedsheet. Some of the boys had wanted to fight. Klaus had wanted to fight. They'd been trained to fight. But Zimmermann had grabbed the nearest boy's rifle and smashed it against a tree. Then he'd shouted one sentence that ended the war for Klaus Steiner. "They'll let us live if we surrender. They'll kill us if we don't. That's the only choice left." The Americans had processed them with mechanical efficiency. Hands up, walk forward. Drop any weapons, stand in line. A medic had examined Klaus's malnourished frame and given him a chocolate bar. Klaus had assumed it was poisoned and hadn't eaten it for 3 hours. When he finally gave in to hunger and took a bite, the sweetness had been so overwhelming he'd vomited into the mud. Now, 6 hours after capture, Klaus sat in the compound with real coffee, and his entire conception of reality was fracturing like glass struck by a hammer. The first major crack had been the coffee. The second came 20 minutes later when American trucks arrived carrying steel drums of food. The smell hit the prisoners before they saw anything. Meat. Actual meat being cooked. Onions. Potatoes. The scent rolled across the compound like a physical force, and 300 half-starved men surged toward the wire before guards shouted them back into formation. Klaus's stomach clenched so hard he doubled over. They lined up with their tin cups. A black American soldier, expressionless and professional, ladled thick stew into each cup. Chunks of beef. Real potatoes. Carrots. Gravy so rich it reflected the afternoon light. Klaus stared at the food. He'd been taught that Negroes were subhuman, barely capable of speech, fit only for menial labor. This man wore the same uniform as the white soldiers, carried the same rifle, and served food with the same mechanical competence. The contradiction was too large to process, so Klaus simply held out his cup and watched it fill. The portion was enormous. More food than Klaus had seen in a single meal since before the war. More than his family ate in 3 days. He carried the cup back to his place in the mud, sat down, and began eating with shaking hands. The taste obliterated thought. Hot, salty. The meat fell apart between his teeth. The vegetables had been cooked with butter. Butter. Klaus hadn't tasted butter in 18 months. Around him, men were weeping openly as they ate. Horst Becker consumed his portion in 90 seconds and immediately vomited it back up, his shrunken stomach unable to process the richness. He scraped the vomit from the mud and ate it again. No one mocked him. They all understood. "This is better than what we fed our own soldiers," said Franz Kohler, a 29-year-old Wehrmacht corporal who'd been swept into the Volkssturm after recovering from wounds. "I was at Stalingrad. We got watery soup and black bread. This is what they feed their prisoners." "It's propaganda," Horst insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "They're showing off. Tomorrow it'll be different." But Klaus was beginning to understand that tomorrow wouldn't be different. This wasn't a show. This was Tuesday. The Americans fed their prisoners this way every day because they could. Because they had so much food that feeding captured enemies didn't strain their logistics. Because the industrial machine that had crushed Germany didn't just make tanks and airplanes. It made everything. That night, Klaus slept in the mud of the compound, surrounded by 300 other men doing the same. They had no tents, no blankets. April in Germany meant cold rain and temperatures just above freezing. But Klaus's stomach was full for the first time in months, and that single fact kept him awake, staring at the stars long after exhaustion should have claimed him. He kept thinking about the coffee, the stew, the mechanical efficiency of the American food service, the casual abundance. Somewhere in his mind, a small voice whispered that he'd been lied to about everything. The unraveling began in earnest the next morning. Wednesday, April 11th, 1945. The guards roused the prisoners at dawn and directed them to a different area of the compound where field showers had been set up. Actual showers, water heated by portable boilers, soap distributed from wooden crates. Klaus hadn't bathed with hot water in 6 months. At home, his mother heated water in a pot for monthly washing. In the Volkssturm, they'd bathed in cold streams when they bathed at all. He stood under the spray, soap in hand, and felt layers of accumulated filth dissolving from his skin. The water was hot enough to steam in the morning air. Around him, naked men stood motionless under their own showers, eyes closed, faces turned toward the warmth like flowers following the sun. "They're wasting fuel," Franz muttered. "Do you understand? They're burning fuel to heat water for prisoners. How much fuel do they have?" The question hung unanswered because none of them could conceive of the answer. Germany had been desperately short of fuel since 1944. Trucks sat immobilized. Tanks were abandoned for lack of gasoline. The Luftwaffe barely flew. Klaus's Volkssturm company had marched everywhere because vehicles had no fuel. The Americans burned fuel to heat shower water for captured enemies. After showering, they were issued clean clothing, not German uniforms. American-made prisoner garments sewn from sturdy canvas. The clothes fit poorly, but they were intact. No holes, no patches, no worn fabric held together by desperation. Klaus had been wearing the same shirt for 3 months. His pants had tears at both knees. His boots leaked. The new clothes were a revelation of abundance expressed through mundane material goods. "Notice the stitching," Franz said, holding up his new shirt. "Machine made, perfect seams." They mass-produced prisoner clothes for us. They anticipated capturing so many of us that they manufactured specialized clothing in advance. What kind of industrial capacity does that require? By now, Klaus's certainty was crumbling. The coffee could have been a special gesture. The stew could have been unusual. But systematic prisoner processing with hot showers and manufactured clothing revealed something deeper. This was bureaucracy applied to victory. This was abundance made routine. The evidence accumulated like snow building toward an avalanche. That afternoon, American medics arrived with boxes of medical supplies. They treated wounds, distributed aspirin, examined sick prisoners. One medic spent 20 minutes cleaning and bandaging a cut on Klaus's hand that he'd received during capture. The medic never spoke, just worked with professional competence, used real gauze and real antiseptic, then moved to the next prisoner. Klaus watched supplies being used. Bandages applied and discarded. Medicine distributed freely. In Germany, aspirin was precious. Bandages were washed and reused. Wounded soldiers often went untreated for lack of basic supplies. Here, Americans used medical supplies on enemy prisoners with the same casual abundance they applied to everything else. The avalanche began to slide. 3 days into captivity, Friday, April 13, 1945, the prisoners were loaded onto trucks for transport to a larger facility. The trucks themselves were a revelation. New vehicles, each carrying 20 men comfortably, convoys stretching a half-mile. Klaus counted 40 trucks. That meant the Americans had 800 trucks just for this one prisoner transport. Germany's entire truck production in 1944 had been 60,000. America's 700,000. One nation manufactured trucks at 12 times the rate of the other, and Klaus was experiencing that disparity firsthand as the convoy rolled smoothly across destroyed German roads. He'd been taught that American industry was weak, that Jewish financiers had corrupted their economy, that their mongrel workforce was lazy and incompetent. But the truck underneath him was solid steel, well-maintained, running smoothly on good tires with a full tank of gasoline. The German trucks he'd seen in the Volkssturm had been wheezing relics held together with wire, running on wood gas generators because there was no fuel. Sitting in the truck bed, Franz leaned close to Klaus. "I spent 2 years on the Eastern Front. We were always told the Americans were soft, unprepared, barely able to fight, that the real enemy was the Soviets. But these Americans fought through France in less than a year. They crossed the Rhine. They encircled our entire army group. They did all this while also fighting Japan on the other side of the world." "How is that possible?" Klaus asked. "Because we were lied to," Franz said. "About everything." The larger prisoner facility was near Remagen, where the Americans had captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact and poured through the Rhine's defenses like water through a broken dam. The facility held 15,000 men. Klaus stared at the numbers. 15,000 prisoners in one camp. The Americans had captured so many Germans, they needed industrial-scale facilities to hold them all. The Ruhr pocket alone yielded over 300,000 prisoners. 300,000. The Americans processed them like an assembly line processes parts. Registration. Medical screening. Housing assignment. Food distribution. Clothing issue. Every step bureaucratic, efficient, routine. They'd built an entire system to manage German defeat. At Remagen, Klaus began to encounter other prisoners with different stories. Werner Schmidt, a Wehrmacht sergeant captured in France, described American artillery barrages that never seemed to end. They fired more shells in one day than we had in our entire army group, Werner said. We called it the steel rain. It went on for hours. You couldn't move. Couldn't fight, just had to hide and pray. And this was routine for them. Every attack started with steel rain. Heinrich Vogel, a Luftwaffe mechanic, talked about American air superiority. I haven't seen a German plane in 3 months, Heinrich said, but the Americans fly overhead constantly. Hundreds of planes. They bomb during the day because they know we can't stop them. Our fighters are grounded for lack of fuel. Theirs fill the sky. Peter Lang, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, described American logistics. When we attacked in December, we thought we'd destroyed their supplies. We captured fuel dumps, ammunition, food. But they just brought more. Endless convoys. We ran out of everything in a week. They never ran out. Ever? How do you fight an enemy who never runs out? Each story added weight to the avalanche. Each testimony contradicted the propaganda. Klaus listened and felt the last pillars of his indoctrination crumbling. But the final breaking point came from something smaller, more mundane, more devastating in its simplicity. Wednesday, April 18, 1945. Klaus was assigned to a work detail sorting American supplies. They spent the day organizing boxes in a warehouse, and Klaus's job was to count canned goods. He counted for 6 hours. Canned meat, canned vegetables, canned fruit, canned milk, box after box after box. The numbers were impossible. Klaus counted 17,000 cans in his assigned section. There were 12 sections, 200,000 cans in one warehouse supplying one army group. And this was routine logistics. The Americans had so much food they put it in cans and shipped it across an ocean and distributed it to millions of soldiers and fed their prisoners and still had enough left over to waste. Klaus sat in the warehouse during a break, surrounded by walls of canned goods, and felt something break inside him. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, just a quiet, complete collapse of everything he'd believed about the world. A can of peaches sat on the floor beside him. Klaus picked it up and read the label. Del Monte, packed in California. Ingredients: peaches, sugar, water. The can was bright, colorful, undamaged. The label showed a picture of perfect peaches. There was an expiration date 3 years in the future. Someone in California had grown peaches, canned them with sugar, printed colorful labels, shipped them across an ocean, and delivered them to Germany to feed soldiers fighting 8,000 miles from home. And this was one can in a warehouse of hundreds of thousands. Klaus thought about his mother eating turnip soup. He thought about the acorn coffee. He thought about Herr Schäfer showing the class his ration card and explaining that the reduced meat allocation was temporary, that victory would restore abundance, that sacrifice was necessary for the fatherland. He thought about every lie he'd been told, every propaganda film, every Hitler Youth meeting where they'd sung songs about German strength and American weakness. The can of peaches wasn't propaganda. It was evidence. It was truth made manifest in bright metal and colorful paper. It proved that everything Klaus had been taught was a lie, and it did so with perfect, undeniable clarity. I want to go home, Klaus said to no one. I just want to go home and tell my mother the truth. But what was the truth? That they'd lost the war to a nation so powerful it canned fruit for its frontline troops? That German sacrifice had been meaningless because they'd been fighting an industrial colossus that produced more in a month than Germany managed in a year. That every boy who died, including his brother Matthias, had died for nothing because the outcome was never in doubt? Klaus turned to Franz, who sat nearby counting boxes of sugar. How long have you known? Known what? That we couldn't win. That we never could win. Franz stopped counting. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Stalingrad. I knew it's Stalingrad, but I couldn't say it. I couldn't even think it too loudly, because if I admitted the war was lost, I'd have to admit that everything we'd done was pointless. All the death, all the suffering, all for nothing. We were fighting America and Britain and Russia simultaneously, Klaus said. How did anyone think that was possible? Because they told us it was possible. And we believed them. Because we wanted to believe. Because the alternative was too terrible to consider. The conversations in the warehouse spread through the prisoner compound like infection. Men who'd fought in Africa described American logistics there. Men who'd defended Italy described American artillery. Men from the Eastern Front described what happened when the Red Army, supplied by American trucks and food, began its unstoppable advance. Every story reinforced the same truth. Germany had been fighting a war it lost the moment it began, and the German people had been kept ignorant of this fact through systematic propaganda. The breaking came in waves, different for each man. For some it was the food, for others the medicine. For Klaus it was canned peaches, but for all of them, eventually, came the moment when denial became impossible and the propaganda shattered against the weight of accumulated evidence. Horst Becker, the postal worker who'd insisted the Americans were fattening them for slaughter, finally admitted defeat on April 20th during morning rations. He'd been given oatmeal with sugar, real butter on bread, and hot coffee. He ate in silence, then turned to Klaus with tears streaming down his face. "My son is still fighting," Horst said. "He's 19. He's somewhere near Berlin. And I let him go, believing the same lies I believed. I told him to fight hard. I told him Germany would prevail. I told him the Americans were monsters." His voice broke. "I fed my son to the war because I believed what Goebbels told me to believe." Klaus had no comfort to offer. He was 17. His brother was already dead. His father was already lost. His mother was starving in Wuppertal. The war was ending not with German victory, but with complete annihilation. And Klaus's only contribution had been 43 days in the Volkssturm before surrendering without firing a shot. But at least he was alive. At least he'd learned the truth. At least he could go home eventually and tell his mother that the Americans weren't monsters, that the war was lost because Germany had challenged an opponent so overwhelmingly superior that defeat was inevitable from the start, that Matthias had died for a lie, but that the lying was finally over. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Klaus heard the news in the prisoner compound during afternoon work detail. An American officer made an announcement through a translator. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had fallen. Germany would be occupied by the Allied powers. The prisoners received the news in silence. No cheering, no celebration. Just silence and the sound of the wind across the compound. What was there to celebrate? That the killing had stopped? That the lies could finally end? That they'd survived while 60 million others hadn't? Klaus was processed for release in July 1945. He'd gained 20 pounds in captivity. He was healthier leaving American custody than he'd been in German service. He received a discharge certificate, a set of civilian clothes, and travel papers allowing him to return to Wuppertal. The journey home took 6 days. Klaus walked through a destroyed country and saw the truth everywhere. Ruined cities, bombed factories, infrastructure shattered. The landscape bore witness to overwhelming defeat by overwhelming force. Every broken building was evidence. Every crater proved the disparity. Germany lay in ruins because it had fought an opponent capable of reducing nations to rubble and then feeding the survivors from canned goods shipped across an ocean. Wuppertal was worse than Klaus remembered, 70% destroyed. His family's apartment building had partially collapsed. His mother lived in 3 rooms with no glass in the windows. She'd lost 40 pounds. She wept when she saw him, held him for 10 minutes without speaking, then immediately began apologizing that she had no food to offer. Klaus reached into his bag and pulled out 3 cans of American peaches he'd hidden during processing. The guards had looked the other way. They knew. He set the cans on the makeshift table and watched his mother stare at them as if they'd fallen from heaven. "Where did you get these?" "The Americans gave them to me." "The Americans? But you were their prisoner." "Yes. They fed you every day. Real food. Meat, vegetables, coffee, butter. They fed us better than our own army fed its soldiers." His mother picked up one of the cans, turned it over in her hands, read the label. Del Monte. Packed in California, she began crying. Not quietly, deep racking sobs that shook her thin frame. Klaus held her and understood. She was crying for Matthias. For the lies. For the hunger. For the war that had taken everything and left them with nothing except canned peaches from a nation they'd been taught to hate. Klaus Steiner spent the rest of his life thinking about those weeks in April 1945. He became an engineer as he'd always dreamed. He married. He raised children. He never joined a political party. He never allowed his children to attend rallies. He taught them to question everything, especially claims about national greatness and enemy weakness. In 1985, 40 years after the war, a journalist interviewed Klaus for a documentary about the Volkssturm. The journalist asked what he remembered most clearly from his time as a soldier. Klaus thought for a long moment. Then he said, "The coffee. The first cup of real coffee an American gave me through the wire. It didn't just prove they weren't monsters. It proved we'd been fighting an enemy so powerful they could afford to be kind to us. That was more terrifying than any propaganda monster could ever be. Because monsters you can fight. But how do you fight a nation so wealthy, so powerful, so organized that they defeat you and then feed you better than your own country ever did? You can't. You can only surrender and try to learn from the truth." The journalist asked if Klaus felt betrayed by the lies he'd been told. "Betrayed is too small a word," Klaus said. "I was 17. I believed everything. I would have died believing it. The real horror isn't that they lied. The real horror is how completely we believed the lies. We wanted to believe. We needed to believe. Because the truth, the real truth about how outmatched we were, would have been too devastating to accept. Do you think Germany learned from the war?" Klaus was quiet. Then he said, "We learned that wars are lost in factories and fields before they're lost on battlefields. We learned that propaganda is most effective when people want to believe it. We learned that truth, real truth, often comes in the form of small things. A cup of coffee, a can of peaches. Evidence that contradicts everything you thought you knew about the world. If you could tell your 17-year-old self anything, what would it be?" Klaus smiled, though his eyes were sad. "I'd tell him to read the numbers. Production figures, resource allocation, military capabilities. I'd tell him that propaganda always lies, but numbers tell the truth if you're brave enough to see it. But I wouldn't have listened. 17-year-olds don't listen. They believe. That's what makes them such good soldiers and such tragic victims." Klaus Steiner died in 2003 at the age of 75. Among his possessions, his family found a dented tin can with a faded label. Del Monte Peaches. Packed in California. Expiration date, April 1948. His daughter asked why he'd kept it all those years. His wife explained, "He kept it to remember. Not to remember the war, to remember the moment truth broke through all the lies." He said that can of peaches taught him more about history than any book. It taught him that wars are won by nations that can produce canned fruit for their frontline troops, and lost by nations that can't feed their own children. He kept it to remember what truth looks like when you've been surrounded by lies for so long you've forgotten it exists. The dented can sits now in a museum in Wuppertal, part of an exhibit on the war's end. Visitors read the label and see only a piece of trash preserved for decades. They don't understand what it meant to a starving boy who'd been taught that his enemies were monsters, only to discover they were human beings backed by an industrial machine so vast it could simultaneously destroy his nation and keep him alive. Stories like Klaus Steiner's reveal the war's hidden truth, that Germany's defeat was inevitable, not because German soldiers weren't brave or German weapons weren't advanced, but because they were fighting an opponent whose power they'd been systematically prevented from understanding. The propaganda worked until it didn't. The lies held until they couldn't. And the truth, when it finally arrived, came not in dramatic form, but in mundane evidence. Coffee, soap, canned peaches. The ordinary products of an extraordinary industrial power that Germany had challenged and lost to before the first shot was ever fired. If you want to hear more untold stories from World War II, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this story is making you think differently about history, leave a comment. I'd love to know what surprised you most. Klaus's story is just one of thousands. Every week, tens of thousands of German soldiers experienced the same transformation. The same shattering of illusions, the same terrible awakening to truth. They'd been lied to comprehensively, systematically, completely. And when the lies finally broke, they broke not with dramatic revelations, but with simple evidence that couldn't be denied. The enemy they'd been taught to fear had defeated them with abundance. The can of peaches remained, long after Klaus was gone, a testament to the power of truth and the danger of propaganda. It sits in its museum case today, a dented piece of metal and faded paper, proving that sometimes the smallest objects carry the biggest lessons. Sometimes a can of fruit can teach you more about power and defeat than any weapon ever could. Sometimes truth comes not from speeches or manifestos, but from the simple, undeniable evidence of what your enemy can afford to waste while your own people starve.